Hey friends, tonight we're stepping into the rich, strange, and often spooky world of European folklore. A vast tapestry of myths, legends, and local tales passed down through generations. From forest spirits to forgotten gods, this is the entire story of European folklore, explained in a way that hopefully won't keep you up all night. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, or a space heater if you're leaning into comfort over historical accuracy. Let's settle in and explore the legends that shaped a continent.
The forest is alive, and it's watching you. Before the first church bell ever rang across a European valley, there was the forest. It was not merely a collection of trees, a source of timber and game. To the people who lived on its edges, the forest was a living entity, an ancient, breathing power with a memory far longer than any human life. It was the great, untamed heart of the world. Imagine yourself a peasant in the 10th century. Your village is a small island of order in a vast green sea of wilderness. The forest is your lifeblood. From its depths you gather wood for your hearth, herbs for your remedies, berries and nuts for your pot, and acorns for your pigs. It provides the charcoal that fuels the blacksmith's forge and the sturdy oak that will one day become the frame of your home. You depend on it, utterly. Because the forest does not belong to you. It belongs to itself, and it is always watching. Every shadow seems to hold a shape. Every rustle of leaves sounds like a whisper just beyond your understanding. The wind sighing through the pines is not just wind, it is the forest breathing, and sometimes it sounds like a warning. This was not a flight of fancy. It was a fundamental truth of the world. You understood that certain groves were not to be entered. These were the sacred places, home to powers that had ruled the land long before your ancestors arrived. An ancient, gnarled oak, its branches twisted like the arthritic fingers of a giant, was not just a tree, it was the dwelling place of a dryad, or perhaps even an old god whose name was no longer spoken aloud. To take an axe to such a tree without the proper rites, a whispered apology, a small offering of milk or bread, was to invite disaster. Your axe might slip, a sickness might take your child, or your cow might run dry. The forest remembers every trespass. These were the lands of the Genius Luci, the spirit of the place. Every forest had its own unique character, its own invisible warden. In the deep woods of Gaul and Germania, this might be a horned figure, a master of animals glimpsed for a moment between the trees, a fleeting vision of antlers and intelligent eyes. This was not the devil of the Christian priests. This was something older, wilder, a force of nature itself, neither good nor evil, but immensely powerful. And then there were the others. The Fae, the good folk, the fair folk. They were not the tiny winged sprites of later stories. They were the original inhabitants of the land, a race of beings as tall as humans, beautiful and terrible, who had been pushed into the hollow hills and the deep, shadowed parts of the wood by the encroaching world of men. They were masters of illusion, their magic potent and incomprehensible. To them, human lives were as fleeting as the lives of mayflies. They were capricious, easily offended, and held a deep-seated grudge against the iron tools and church bells that weakened their power. A medieval woodsman knew the rules. Never speak their true name aloud. Never eat their food or drink their wine lest you become trapped in their world forever. And above all, never, ever follow the sound of their music if you hear it drifting from a moonlit clearing. The melodies were said to be so enchanting that they could lure a mortal to dance until their heart gave out, or lead them into a fairy mound from which they might never return. The forest was a place of liminality, a threshold between the world of mankind and the other world. Certain places were more porous than others. A spring bubbling up from deep within the earth was a gateway. A stand of white-barked birch trees under a full moon was a place of power. The tangled roots of an ancient yew tree, often found growing in the old burial grounds, were said to reach down into the land of the dead. When Christianity spread, it sought to tame this wild spirituality. Priests declared the old gods to be demons and the forest spirits to be minions of Satan. They cut down the sacred oaks and built churches on top of pagan mounds. They taught that the forest was a place of temptation and sin, a wilderness to be conquered and cleared for the glory of God and man. But belief is a stubborn root. It does not die easily. For the common person, the fear and respect for the forest remained. While they may have prayed to Christ in the village church, they still left a small bowl of cream at the edge of the woods. They still avoided the grove where the mist always seemed to hang low. They taught their children not to wander too far from the path, not just because of wolves and bears, but because of what was watching from between the trees. The forest was a living paradox. It was the source of life and the keeper of death. It was a place of profound spiritual power and terrifying, inhuman danger. It held the raw materials for civilization and the ancient chaos that threatened to undo it all. For the medieval European, to step under the canopy of the great woods was to step out of the ordered world and into a story much, much older than their own. And in the quiet moments, when the axe was still and the birds were silent, they could feel it, the deep, slow, and patient consciousness of the forest, watching them, judging them, and waiting.
The household spirits under your floorboards. Let us leave the vast, dark expanse of the forest and draw closer to home. Step inside a medieval cottage. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and cooking stew. A single candle, or the light from the hearth, pushes back the shadows, but it doesn't banish them. The corners of the room remain steeped in darkness, and in that darkness, you are not alone. Just as the forest had its spirits, so too did the home. Every household, from the humblest hovel to the most prosperous farmhouse, was believed to have an invisible inhabitant, a spirit bound not to the people, but to the place itself. This creature was a part of the family, in a way, a silent, watchful, and deeply influential member who lived under the floorboards, in the attic, or behind the warm bricks of the hearth. In the British Isles, he was known as the brownie, a small, shaggy, human-like figure, often described as wearing simple brown clothes. The brownie was a creature of routine and morality. If the family was hard-working, honest, and kind, the brownie would be their greatest ally. While the household slept, he would emerge from his hiding place. He might finish the churning of the butter, mend a broken tool, sweep the floor, or tidy the kitchen. The family would wake to find their chores mysteriously completed, a small miracle that made their hard lives just a little bit easier. But the brownie was not a servant. He was a guardian, and he demanded respect. The rules were simple but strict. A bowl of fresh milk or a piece of good bread should be left for him by the hearth each night. This was not payment, it was a gift, an acknowledgement of his presence and his work. To try and pay the brownie with money or to offer him a set of new clothes was a grave insult. It suggested he was a mere laborer, and he would vanish in an instant, taking the luck of the house with him,
and you did not want to lose the luck of the house. A slighted brownie could become a boggart. Instead of helping, he would cause mischief. Milk would sour overnight. Tools would go missing. A sleeper might be pinched or have their blankets pulled off in the dead of night. These were not malicious acts, not yet. They were warnings, signs that the household had fallen out of balance. Across the continent, the spirit took on different names and forms, but its function was remarkably similar. In Germany and Scandinavia, he was the kobold or the tomte. The tomte, or nisse, was often depicted as a small elderly man with a long white beard and a red cap, a figure that would later evolve into the modern garden gnome and even influence the appearance of Santa Claus. He was the protector of the farmstead, watching over the livestock and the children. He asked for little more than a bowl of porridge with a pat of butter on Christmas Eve. But if his porridge was forgotten, or if the farmer was lazy or cruel to his animals, the tomte's anger could be formidable. He might lame the best horse, tie the cows' tails together, or break the most valuable piece of pottery in the house. In Slavic lands, he was the domovoi, the spirit of the home itself. He was seen as the ancestor of the family, a primal guardian whose presence was tied to the very foundation of the house. The domovoi lived behind the stove, and his mood determined the fortune of the family. A happy domovoi meant a warm, prosperous, and peaceful home. An unhappy one brought discord, sickness, and financial ruin. When a family moved, they would perform a ritual to invite the domovoi to come with them. They would leave an old boot by the hearth and whisper, "Domovoi, domovoi, don't stay here, come with us to our new home." They would then carry the boot to the new house, ensuring the family's luck and protection came with them. These beings were the personification of the house's soul. In an age with no insurance, no social safety net, and where a single stroke of bad luck could mean starvation, the idea of a household guardian was a profound comfort. These spirits explained the unexplainable. Why did one family's cow give plentiful milk while their neighbor's was sickly? The first family must have a happy tomte. Why did one house feel warm and welcoming while another felt cold and full of strife? The second must have angered their domovoi. These beliefs dictated the rhythm of daily life. The last sheaf of the harvest was often left in the field for the spirits. The first jug of ale from a new brew was poured onto the ground as an offering. Sweeping the floor after sunset was considered bad luck, as you might sweep the household spirit out of the door. These were not superstitions. They were practical measures for maintaining a good relationship with the unseen forces that governed your world. The church, of course, had a different view. To them, these spirits were demons in disguise, tricking foolish peasants into pagan worship. A priest might be called to exorcise a particularly troublesome spirit, but more often than not, the old beliefs persisted alongside the new faith. A person could pray to God in the morning and leave milk for the brownie at night without seeing a contradiction. One was for the salvation of the soul, the other was for the preservation of the home. These household spirits represent a deep, intuitive understanding of our relationship with our living spaces. They are the spirit of domesticity, the feeling that a house is more than just wood and stone. It is a living thing that responds to care, respect, and hard work. They are the unseen force that turns a structure into a home. So the next time you hear an unexplained creak in the floorboards or find a misplaced object in a tidy room, perhaps it is not just the house settling. Perhaps it is an ancient, watchful presence, checking to see if you have left it a bowl of milk by the hearth.
Pagan echoes in Christian villages. The narrator. The arrival of Christianity in Europe was not a swift, clean replacement of one belief system with another. It was a slow, complex, and often messy process of absorption and adaptation.
The cross was raised in the village square, but the roots of the old ways ran deep beneath the soil, and they continued to send up shoots in the most unexpected of places. For centuries, the medieval village existed in a state of spiritual duality, where the rituals of the church were woven together with folk traditions that were far, far older. Imagine a village in the heart of Europe, sometime in the 12th or 13th century. It is a Christian village. The church is the tallest building, its stone walls a symbol of permanence and power. The priest preaches the gospel, baptizes the newborn, marries the young, and buries the dead. The calendar is marked by saints' days and religious festivals, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. The people are, by all outward appearances, devout Christians. But listen closely. Watch what they do when the formal rituals are over. As spring finally breaks the grip of winter, the young people of the village go into the woods and cut down a tall, straight birch or pine tree. They strip it of its lower branches, decorate it with ribbons and flowers, and erect it in the center of the village green. This is the maypole. The priest might bless it, framing it as a celebration of God's creation. But everyone understands its older meaning. It is a potent symbol of fertility, a phallic totem driven into the earth to awaken its life-giving powers after the long winter sleep. The dance that weaves the ribbons around the pole is not just a game, it is a ritual, a sympathetic magic designed to ensure that the crops will grow tall and the livestock will be fruitful. It is a pagan rite hiding in plain sight. Or consider the night of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. This becomes the feast of St. John the Baptist. On this night, after the church services are done, the entire village gathers on a hilltop. They build enormous bonfires, their flames leaping high into the twilight sky. The official reason is to honor the saint, who was called a burning and shining light. But the true purpose is much older. These are the midsummer fires, a tradition stretching back into prehistory. The people believe the fire has purifying power. They drive their cattle between two bonfires to protect them from disease for the coming year. Young men and women leap over the flames, a test of courage and a ritual for securing a good marriage and healthy children. The ashes from the fire are then scattered over the fields to guarantee a bountiful harvest. They are warding off evil spirits, which are thought to be at their most powerful on this magical night when the veil between worlds is thin. They are celebrating the sun at the peak of its power, and simultaneously performing magic to prevent its slow decline into the darkness of winter. Even the Christian holidays themselves were layered over older pagan festivals. Christmas was placed at the time of the winter solstice, absorbing ancient traditions associated with the rebirth of the sun. The Yule log, burned in the hearth for 12 days, was a Norse tradition to honor the god Thor and encourage the sun to return. The holly and ivy used to decorate the church were sacred to the Druids, symbols of life's persistence in the dead of winter. Easter, the celebration of Christ's resurrection, coincided with festivals honoring Eoster, a Germanic goddess of the dawn and of spring. The symbols we still associate with the holiday, eggs and rabbits, were ancient symbols of fertility and new life, entirely pagan in origin. They were so deeply ingrained in the culture that the church could not stamp them out. Instead, it absorbed them, gave them new Christian meanings, and claimed them as its own. This blending of beliefs, known as syncretism, was a practical necessity. The church understood that it was easier to convert a population by allowing them to keep their familiar customs and simply reframing them in a Christian context. A sacred well dedicated to a water spirit could be rededicated to the Virgin Mary. A hilltop shrine to a sky god could become the site of a chapel for St. Michael the Archangel. For the average villager, there was no sharp distinction. Their spiritual world was a rich tapestry woven from both threads. They would pray to a saint for intercession, but they would also know which herbs to hang over their door to ward off evil spirits. They would attend Mass, but they would also know the proper words to whisper to the bees to keep them from swarming. This was not heresy in their minds. It was a complete toolkit for survival in a dangerous world. The priest offered salvation for the next life, but the old ways offered practical help for this one. These pagan echoes were a source of constant frustration for church authorities. Councils and synods would repeatedly condemn these superstitious practices. Zealous bishops would order the destruction of sacred trees and stones, but the traditions persisted, passed down from mother to daughter, from father to son. They were embedded in the agricultural year, in the turning of the seasons, and in the very landscape the people inhabited. The maypole, the solstice fire, the Yule log, they were more than just folk customs. They were the lingering ghosts of an older worldview, a time when the divine was not in a distant heaven, but was present in the earth, the water, and the sky. They were a testament to the resilience of belief, and a reminder that even in the age of cathedrals and crusades, the ancient heart of pagan Europe was still, quietly, stubbornly beating.
Fairy rings and vanishing time. The world of the medieval peasant was small and sharply defined. The village, the church, the surrounding fields, this was the known world. Beyond it lay the wilderness, and in the wilderness there were places where the rooms of reality seemed to bend and break. One of the most enchanting and most feared of these phenomena was the fairy ring. You are walking through a meadow at dusk, perhaps taking a shortcut home. The grass is damp with dew, and there, in the fading light, you see it, a perfect circle of mushrooms, or perhaps just a ring of darker, lusher grass where no mushrooms grow. Your heart quickens. Your grandmother's warnings echo in your mind. This is not a natural formation. This is a place where they have been. This is a fairy ring, a place where the fae folk have danced. To the modern eye, a fairy ring is a simple biological event, the result of a fungus growing outward from a central point. But in the medieval mind, such a perfect circle could only be supernatural. It was a temporary portal, a place where the veil between our world and the other world had worn thin. It was the visible trace of a fairy revel, a wild magical dance held under the moon. The stories told about these rings were cautionary tales, whispered by the fireside. The most common warning was simple and absolute. Do not, under any circumstances, step inside the circle. To do so was to place yourself in the power of the fair folk. The consequences varied, but they were never good. At best, you might be forced to dance with them. The music of the fae was said to be irresistible, and you would dance and dance unable to stop until you collapsed from sheer exhaustion, sometimes even dancing yourself to death. But a far stranger and more terrifying fate was the distortion of time. This is a recurring theme in Celtic and Germanic folklore. Time in the other world does not flow at the same rate as it does in ours. A person who stumbled into a fairy ring might think they had only been gone for a few minutes or a single night of dancing and feasting. But when they finally managed to step back out of the circle, they would find that the world they knew was gone. 100 years, or even more, might have passed. Imagine the horror of it. You emerge from the meadow, dazed and confused, and walk back towards your village. But the path is overgrown. The houses look different, older, or perhaps entirely new. You see faces you don't recognize, people wearing strange clothes.
You call out for your wife, your children, your friends, but no one knows their names. They are long dead, dust and memory. You have become a ghost in your own home, a living relic from a forgotten age. In most of these tales, the moment the unfortunate traveler touches something from the new world, a person, or even the ground itself, they crumble into dust, their stolen century catching up to them in a single horrifying instant. These stories served as a powerful deterrent, keeping people away from places that were considered dangerous or taboo. But they also speak to a deeper anxiety. Life was short and brutal. The idea of losing what little time you had, of being erased from your own story, was a profound fear. Not all interactions with fairy rings were so dramatic. Sometimes they were simply markers of a dangerous place. Cattle that grazed within a ring might fall ill or stop giving milk. A house built upon one was doomed to have bad luck, its inhabitants plagued by strange noises and misfortune. There were, of course, ways to protect oneself. A piece of iron, such as a nail or a knife, was believed to repel the fae. The sound of church bells could break their enchantments. Some stories suggested that you could watch the fairies dance from a safe distance, but you must never let them see you, and you must never speak to them. Another folk remedy was to run around the ring 9 times, but always counter-sunwise, against the direction of the sun's journey across the sky. This was said to undo the magic, but it was a risky maneuver. The concept of a separate realm with its own rules and its own flow of time is one of the most enduring elements of European folklore. It is the basis for countless legends, from the story of Oisin in Tír na Og in Irish mythology to the tale of Rip Van Winkle in a later American context. These stories were more than just spooky tales for children. They were a way of understanding the world's mysteries. They explained sudden disappearances. If a person vanished in the woods, it was easier to imagine they had been taken by the fairies than to confront the grim reality that they had likely fallen victim to wolves, outlaws, or a simple, fatal accident. The fairy ring was a physical manifestation of a border. It was a warning sign, etched into the landscape itself, that you were approaching the edge of the human world. It told you that there were other powers, other laws, and other kinds of time. And to cross that border, even for a moment, was to risk everything you knew and loved. It was a beautiful, terrifying reminder that the world was far larger and far stranger than the small patch of earth you called home.
Magic words, curses, and blood oaths. In the medieval world, the air itself seemed to hum with unseen power. This power could be harnessed, directed, and shaped by those who knew the old ways. Magic was not a fantasy, it was a practical, if dangerous, part of everyday life. It existed in the words you spoke, the herbs you gathered, and the intentions you held in your heart. It was a force that could heal or harm, protect or destroy. The foundation of much of this magic was the spoken word. It was believed that certain words, phrases, or names held an intrinsic power. To speak them aloud was to release that power into the world. This is why the names of powerful entities like the Fae or even the Devil were often avoided. Instead, people used euphemisms, the good folk, the old lad, to avoid drawing their attention. Charms were the most common form of spoken magic. They were little rhymes or incantations passed down through generations, used for every conceivable purpose. A farmer might murmur a charm over his seeds before planting to ensure a good crop. A mother would whisper a chant over her child to drive out a fever. A blacksmith would utter a secret phrase as he quenched a new blade in water, believing it would make the steel stronger.
These charms were often a curious mix of pagan and Christian elements. A charm to stop a wound from bleeding might invoke the name of Christ or a saint, but it would be structured like an older, pre-Christian spell. For example, a popular charm involved reciting a story. As Christ was walking, he saw a river of blood. He said, "River of blood, stop," and the river of blood stopped. So too may this blood stop, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Here, the power of a Christian narrative is used as a magical formula. Written magic was rarer as literacy was not widespread, but it was considered even more potent. Words written down had a permanence and a tangible reality. Runic scripts, from the older Germanic and Norse traditions, were thought to hold immense power. Even after the adoption of the Latin alphabet, runes were sometimes secretly carved onto tools, weapons, or amulets for protection or luck. Latin, the language of the Church, was seen as inherently magical by the uneducated populace. Because they couldn't understand it, the sound of the Mass or a priest's prayer seemed like a powerful incantation. This led to the creation of so-called dog Latin charms, where scraps of misunderstood church Latin were mixed with folk magic to create potent spells. Alongside protective magic, there was its dark twin, the curse. A curse could be laid with a simple, hateful glance, the evil eye. This belief was rampant across Europe, especially in the Mediterranean. It was thought that envy or malice could be projected through a person's gaze, causing illness, misfortune, or even death. People wore amulets, like the blue eye beads still common today, to deflect it. Babies and livestock were considered especially vulnerable. A more formal curse required a spoken declaration, often delivered with great ceremony and emotion. A person who felt that they had been deeply wronged might go to a crossroads at midnight, a place between worlds, and call upon dark forces to bring ruin upon their enemy. These curses were feared because it was believed that once spoken, they had a life of their own and were very difficult to undo. Then there were oaths. In a world with few written contracts, a person's word was their bond, and an oath was the most sacred and binding of promises. To break a simple promise was a sin, but to break a sworn oath was to invite supernatural retribution. Oaths were often sworn on holy relics, on a sword, or on the Bible, but the most powerful of all was the blood oath. In a blood oath, two or more parties would cut themselves and mingle their blood, either by pressing the wounds together or letting the blood drip into a shared cup. This was more than symbolic. It meant they were now family, their very life forces intertwined. To betray someone with whom you had shared blood was the ultimate treachery, and it was believed that the land, the spirits, and God himself would conspire to punish the oathbreaker. The world of medieval folk magic was also a world of natural things imbued with power. Certain herbs were not just medicinal, they were magical. Rosemary was for remembrance. St. John's wort could ward off evil spirits, especially when picked on Midsummer's Eve, and rowanwood was a powerful protector against witchcraft. The placement of these herbs, hung over a door, sewn into a child's clothes, or fed to a cow, was a constant, quiet ritual of protection. Animals, too, had their place in this magical system. The crow was an omen of death, the black cat a familiar of witches, the spider a bringer of good luck if left undisturbed. This entire system of belief, charms, curses, oaths, and herbs, was a way of imposing the sense of order and control on a chaotic and unpredictable world. When your child had a fever and the doctor was miles away, or non-existent, a charm was not superstition, it was action. When your neighbor's crops flourished while yours failed, the evil eye was not a fantasy, it was an explanation. Magic gave people a sense of agency. It was a technology of the soul, a set of tools for navigating the invisible currents that to them were every bit as real as the wind and the rain. It was the whisper that could change the world.
The village witch, healer or heretic? At the edge of the village, often in a small, secluded cottage with a garden full of strange and fragrant plants, lived a figure of immense importance and profound ambiguity, the village witch. But for much of the early medieval period, the word witch did not necessarily conjure images of a cackling demonic servant. More often than not, she was simply the cunning woman, the healer, the midwife, and the keeper of the old knowledge. Imagine your child is burning with a fever that won't break. The priest has prayed, but the child only grows weaker. In desperation, you go to the cunning woman. She is likely an older woman, a widow, who has lived in the village her whole life. She doesn't recoil from the sickness. She examines the child with a practiced eye, listens to your desperate story, and then goes to her garden. She returns with a handful of leaves and flowers. She knows that foxglove, used in a tiny, precise dose, can calm a racing heart. She knows that willow bark can soothe a fever and ease pain. She knows which poultices can draw the infection from a wound and which teas can calm a troubled stomach. This is knowledge passed down through generations, a pharmacopoeia of the fields and forests that predates any written medical text. She is also a midwife, the one who is called when a woman's labor is long and dangerous. She knows how to turn a breech baby, how to ease the mother's pain with herbs and massage, and how to deliver a child safely into the world. In an age of terrifyingly high infant and maternal mortality, her skills are nothing short of miraculous. But her knowledge is not purely physical. It is deeply intertwined with the folk magic we have already explored. As she prepares a remedy, she will murmur a charm over it. She might use holy water, but she might also use water from a sacred spring. She might recommend a prayer to a saint, but also suggest you hang a rowan branch over the cradle to ward off evil spirits who might try to steal the healthy child and leave a sickly changeling in its place. For most of her life, this woman is a respected, if slightly feared, member of the community. People come to her for help with everything: a sick cow, a lost object, a love charm to win the heart of a reluctant suitor, or an amulet to protect a sailor on a long voyage. She is the village's unofficial doctor, veterinarian, and therapist, all rolled into one. She is a vital part of the social fabric. But her position is precarious. It rests on a knife's edge between healing and heresy. Because her power is ambiguous, where does her true knowledge come from? Is it from God, a gift of healing? Or is it from older, darker sources? Her garden contains not only herbs, but poisonous ones as well. The same plant that can heal in small doses can kill in large ones. She knows the secrets of life, but by extension, she must also know the secrets of death. And so, the seeds of suspicion are always present. If she can cure a fever, can she also cause one? If she can create a love charm, can she also create a curse of hatred? All it takes is one stroke of bad luck to turn the village against her. Let's say a sudden hailstorm flattens the crops just before the harvest, or a blight sweeps through the cattle, or a plague descends upon the village and her remedies, for once, do not work. The people, gripped by fear and desperate for an explanation, need someone to blame. Their gaze falls on the old woman at the edge of town. Suddenly, her knowledge seems less like a gift and more like a sinister power. Her muttered charms are no longer prayers, but incantations to demons. Her secluded life is not a sign of wisdom, but a secret, wicked nature. The cow that died, she must have cursed it with the evil eye. The failed harvest, she must have flown through the night and summoned the storm. This suspicion was fertile ground for the Church's growing anxiety about heresy and demonic influence. As the medieval period wore on, and especially into the early modern era, the official theology of witchcraft began to solidify. Theologians and inquisitors wrote books like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, which laid out a terrifying new doctrine.
A witch was no longer just a practitioner of folk magic. She was a heretic who had made a pact with the devil. She had renounced her baptism, attended secret orgiastic sabbats in the woods, and dedicated herself to performing maleficium, malicious magic, to harm the Christian community. Under this new and terrible lens, the village cunning woman was transformed into a monster. Her knowledge of herbs became proof she could create poisons and hallucinogenic flying ointments. Her role as a midwife was twisted into the horrifying accusation that she murdered unbaptized infants to use their bodies in magical rites. Her animal companions, a cat, a toad, a crow, were reimagined as familiars, demons in animal form given to her by Satan to assist in her evil deeds. And so the woman who had once cured your child with foxglove could now be dragged from her home, accused of heresy, and tortured until she confessed to impossible crimes. The line between healer and heretic was erased, replaced by a stake and a pyre. This was the tragic paradox of the village witch. Her power to save lives was the very thing that could ultimately condemn her to a terrible death, a victim of the same community she had once protected.
The Devil's Bridge and the Price of Stone.
Across the rugged landscapes of medieval Europe, there are bridges, ancient, beautiful stone structures, often with a high, elegant arch, that span treacherous rivers and deep gorges. Many of them are still in use today, a testament to the skill of their builders. But if you ask about the history of these bridges, you may hear a story that has nothing to do with mortal engineers and everything to do with a cunning bargain. You may be told that you are looking at a devil's bridge. The legend, which exists in countless variations across Germany, Switzerland, France, Italy, and beyond, follows a familiar pattern. A small town or village is cut off by a powerful, impassable river. The current is too strong, the gorge too deep for any human builder to conquer. Every attempt to build a bridge has failed. The foundations washed away by floods, the workers plagued by accidents. The river is like a hungry beast, refusing to be tamed. The townspeople are desperate. Their trade is failing. They are isolated and they are losing hope. In their darkest hour, a stranger appears. He is often described as a well-dressed nobleman or a skilled architect, and he makes them an astonishing offer. He will build a magnificent, indestructible bridge for them, and he will do it overnight. The price? The soul of the first living thing to cross it. The villagers, knowing full well who this stranger must be, are terrified. But their desperation outweighs their fear. They agree to the pact. The stranger is, of course, the devil himself. True to his word, he summons his demonic powers, and through the night, a perfect stone bridge rises over the chasm, an impossible feat of engineering, completed by dawn. The next morning, the villagers gather, awestruck and terrified. The bridge is real, but now the price must be paid. The devil waits on the other side, eager to claim his prize. Here the story takes a clever turn. The villagers, or often a clever priest or a cunning mayor, devise a plan to outwit the Prince of Darkness. Instead of a person, they chase a goat, a dog, or a rooster across the bridge. The animal scampers over the new stonework, becoming the first living thing to cross. The devil, enraged at being tricked, lets out a terrible roar. In some versions of the story, he snatches the animal's soul and vanishes in a puff of sulphurous smoke. In others, he is so furious that he tries to destroy his own creation, grabbing a huge boulder to smash the bridge. But he is stopped, either by the sight of a cross, the sound of church bells, or the cleverness of a saint, and the boulder slips from his grasp, landing harmlessly nearby, where it can often still be seen today as a devil's stone. The bridge remains, a permanent monument to a broken pact, a victory of human cunning over supernatural evil. These stories are more than just entertaining fables. They are a profound reflection of the medieval relationship with technology, ambition, and the natural world. Building a large stone bridge was, for its time, an act of almost superhuman ambition. It was a conquest of nature, a defiance of the raw power of a river that had, for centuries, dictated the lives of the people. Such a feat seemed to be beyond the scope of normal human ability. It felt magical, or, to the medieval mind, demonic. The legend of the Devil's Bridge explains how such an impossible thing could exist. It acknowledges the sheer audacity of the project by attributing it to a supernatural force. But it also domesticates that fear. By having the villagers trick the devil, the story asserts human ingenuity and faith. It says, yes, this bridge is so grand it must have been built by the devil, but we were clever enough to get it for free. The story also carries a moral warning about ambition and shortcuts. The villagers, in their desire for progress and prosperity, were willing to make a deal with the ultimate evil. The story validates their need for the bridge, but simultaneously cautions against paying too high a moral price for worldly advancement. Dozens of these Teufelsbrücke, Pont du Diable, or Ponte del Diavolo, still stand. The tale is often so tied to the location that local features are woven into the narrative. The aforementioned Devil's Stone is a common trope. In some places, a small niche or carving on the bridge is said to be where the devil rested, or where the image of a goat or dog was placed to commemorate the trick. These bridges were liminal spaces, just like the forest's edge or a fairy ring. They connected two separate places, spanning a dangerous void. They were thresholds. And at thresholds, supernatural bargains are made. The story of the Devil's Bridge is a powerful folk memory of a time when humanity took a great leap forward, taming a piece of the wild world. It is the story of a community's fear of its own ambition and its ultimate triumph, not just over the river, but over the very devil they imagined was necessary to conquer it. It is a monument, not just of stone, but of a story that allowed people to live with the magnificent and slightly terrifying evidence of their own progress.
Werewolves in the Winter Wood. As the days grow short and the grip of winter tightens, the world outside the cottage walls becomes a place of profound menace. The snow muffles all sound, and the forest, now a skeleton of black branches against a gray sky, seems to close in. It is a time of hunger for both man and beast, and in the heart of that hungry darkness, one fear reigns supreme, the fear of the werewolf. The werewolf, or lycanthrope, is not a creature of fantasy, but a deep-seated, primal terror in the European psyche. It is the terrifying fusion of the two greatest threats to a rural medieval community, the wild predator and the evil within humanity itself. It is the beast without and the beast within, made one. To the medieval villager, the wolf was a very real and present danger. Packs of wolves, driven by hunger, would grow bold in winter, stalking the edges of the village, preying on livestock, and sometimes even attacking lone travelers or children who strayed too far from home. The howl of a wolf on a cold, clear night was a sound that chilled the blood. But the werewolf was something more. It was not just a wolf.
It was a man, or sometimes a woman, who, through a curse, a pact with the devil, or some dark inherited trait, had the power to transform into a ravenous wolf. This was the ultimate betrayal of the natural order. The werewolf retained the cunning of a human, but was driven by the insatiable hunger of a wolf. It was a killer that could walk among you by day, disguised as your neighbor, your friend, or even your family member. Stories of werewolves were whispered around the hearth on long winter nights, serving as both entertainment and a grim warning. They told of shepherds who found their flocks slaughtered, not just eaten, but torn apart with a frenzy that no normal wolf would display. They told of lone woodsmen who vanished, leaving behind nothing but a trail of blood in the snow and tracks that seemed to shift from human boots to wolf paws. How did one become a werewolf? The methods varied by region. In some traditions, it was a curse laid upon a family for generations. In others, it was a punishment for sacrilege, such as eating meat during Lent. A common belief was that a person could become a werewolf by drinking water from a wolf's paw print or by sleeping outside under a full moon on a certain night of the year. But as the fear of diabolism grew, the werewolf became increasingly associated with Satan. A man might make a pact with the devil, being given a special wolf skin or a magical salve. When he donned the skin or applied the ointment, the transformation would take place. This connected lycanthropy directly to witchcraft and heresy, making the werewolf not just a monster, but a servant of evil. Unlike the cinematic werewolves of modern fiction, the transformation was not always tied to the full moon. While the moon was often a factor, many tales describe voluntary transformations. The man simply chose to become the beast. The horror lay in this choice, the willing surrender of humanity for monstrous power and freedom. The telltale signs of a werewolf in human form were subtle. They might be unusually hairy, with eyebrows that met in the middle, or have long, sharp finger fingers. Often they were described as being melancholic, brooding, and reclusive, their human spirit struggling against the beast. The only way to truly identify a werewolf was to injure it in its wolf form. If you managed to cut off a wolf's paw during an attack, the story often went, you would later find your suspect missing a hand. This trope appears in countless tales, the physical wound being the one thing that cannot be concealed by the transformation. The fear of werewolves was so real that it led to actual trials. The case of Peter Stump in the 16th century Germany is one of the most famous. Stump, a wealthy farmer, was accused of being a werewolf and, under horrific torture, confessed to murdering and eating dozens of people, including his own son. He claimed the devil had given him a magical belt that allowed him to transform. He was brutally executed, his story printed and circulated as a terrifying warning. While many of these werewolf trials were likely cases of serial killers, mental illness, or simply village hysteria, they show how deeply this belief was embedded in the legal and social fabric of the time. The werewolf represents a profound fear of the hidden nature of man. In a small, close-knit community where everyone knew each other, the idea that one of your neighbors could be a literal monster was the ultimate social horror. It spoke to the animalistic urges that civilization tried to suppress. The hunger, the violence, the rage. The werewolf was a symbol of what could happen if the veneer of humanity was stripped away. So when the blizzard howled outside and the fire burned low, the stories of the werewolf served a crucial purpose. They reminded children to stay indoors, travelers to avoid the woods after dark,
and everyone to be wary of the darkness that might not just be in the forest, but in the heart of the person sitting next to them.
Dancing plagues and cursed villages. History remembers the medieval period for the plague of the body, the Black Death, which swept away a third of Europe's population. But there was another, stranger affliction that haunted the era, a plague of the mind and spirit, a bizarre phenomenon that could seize an entire town and force it to dance uncontrollably until the dancers collapsed from exhaustion, injury, or death. This was the dancing plague, or choreomania. The most famous and well-documented outbreak occurred in the city of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. It began with a single woman known as Frau Trophia. One day, she stepped out of her house and began to dance, silently and with a strange intensity, in the middle of the street. There was no music. Her face was blank. She simply danced. She did not stop for hours, her husband and neighbors watching in bewilderment. She danced through the night, her feet bleeding, her body drenched in sweat, until she finally collapsed, only to begin again after a few hours of fitful rest. Within a week, she had been joined by more than 30 others. Within a month, the number of dancers had swelled to over 400. The city authorities were baffled. They were not superstitious men. They were the educated leaders of a prosperous city. Their first diagnosis was medical. They believed the dancers were suffering from hot blood, and their prescribed cure was, paradoxically, more dancing. They cleared out the guild halls, erected a large wooden stage in the public market, and even hired musicians to accompany the afflicted, believing that if the dancers could just dance the fever out, they would be cured. This, of course, had the opposite effect. The music and the public spectacles seemed only to encourage more people to join the frantic, desperate dance. The scene must have been horrifying. Hundreds of people, jerking, hopping, and twirling, their faces contorted in agony, their cries and moans mixing with the hired music. They were not dancing for joy. They were prisoners in their own bodies. Day after day, the macabre festival continued under the hot summer sun. People began to die. Heart attacks, strokes, and sheer brutal exhaustion claimed victims daily. When the medical solution failed, the authorities turned to a spiritual one. They concluded that this must be a curse, a punishment from a wrathful saint, likely Saint Vitus, a patron saint who is often invoked against neurological disorders like epilepsy and, tellingly, chorea, a term for jerky, involuntary movements. The dancers were loaded onto wagons and taken to a shrine dedicated to the saint, where priests performed exorcisms and prayed for their deliverance. Eventually, the mania subsided, but not before leaving a trail of death and terror in its wake. What could cause such a thing? The Strasbourg case was not unique. Similar outbreaks were recorded across Europe from the 14th to the 17th centuries, often along the Rhine and Moselle rivers. The medieval mind had its own explanations. It was a curse from God for the sins of the people. It was demonic possession on a mass scale. Or it was the malevolent magic of a powerful witch. Modern historians and scientists have proposed other theories. One compelling hypothesis is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on damp rye, the staple grain for bread in many of these regions. The fungus contains psychoactive alkaloids chemically related to LSD. Consuming tainted bread could cause convulsions, hallucinations, and delirium. This could explain the bizarre behavior, but it doesn't fully account for the organized, rhythmic nature of the dancing, or why it was so contagious. Another theory points to mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria. Imagine a community living under immense psychological stress. These were times of famine, disease, and radical social and religious upheaval. The fear was constant and overwhelming. In this pressure cooker environment, the theory goes, the distress of one person could trigger a chain reaction, spreading through the population like a virus.
The dancing became a desperate physical outlet for a collective psychological trauma that had no other means of expression. The curse of St. Vitus' explanation is also revealing. The belief that a saint could inflict such a punishment shows how deeply intertwined faith and fear were. The same power that could heal could also harm. The dancers, believing themselves to be cursed, may have been trapped in a feedback loop of faith and fear, their belief in the curse manifesting its physical symptoms. The dancing plagues remain one of history's most unsettling mysteries. They are a chilling example of what can happen when the mind or the community breaks under pressure. They represent a cursed village not in a supernatural sense, but in a psychological one. A place so saturated with fear and anxiety that its people lose control of their own bodies, becoming puppets in a terrifying dance of death. It is a stark reminder that sometimes the most frightening monsters are not those that lurk in the woods, but those that lie dormant within our own collective consciousness.
King Arthur's Ghost and the Sword That Sleeps. Let us turn now from the village and the forest to the halls of power. For folklore was not only the domain of the common peasant, it was a potent force in the lives of kings and nobles, shaping their identities, justifying their rule, and creating legends that would echo across the entire continent. And no legend was more powerful, more adaptable, or more enduring than that of King Arthur. Though we now think of him as quintessentially British, the story of Arthur was a European phenomenon. It began as a whisper in the mist-shrouded hills of Wales and Cornwall, the tale of a Romano-British war leader who fought back against the invading Saxons in the dim years after the fall of Rome. But this historical seed grew into a mighty tree of myth, its branches reaching across the English Channel and taking root in the courts of France, Germany, and beyond. The Arthurian legends, as popularized by writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century and later by French poets like Chrétien de Troyes, were a perfect fusion of different worlds. They blended the old magic of the Celtic Britons with its wizards like Merlin, its enchanted swords like Excalibur, and its otherworldly ladies of the lake, with the new ideals of Christian chivalry. Arthur's court, Camelot, became the idealized image of a perfect Christian kingdom. His Knights of the Round Table were paragons of courage, loyalty, and piety. Their adventures, or quests, were not just battles against dragons and giants, they were spiritual journeys. The ultimate quest, the search for the Holy Grail, the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, was a purely Christian addition to the legend, transforming the knights from mere warriors into soldiers of Christ. This blend of pagan magic and Christian virtue made the story irresistible. Every noble house in Europe wanted a piece of it. French and German poets created their own knights, Lancelot, Percival, Tristan, and wrote sprawling romances about their exploits. To be compared to a Knight of the Round Table was the highest compliment a warrior could receive. The ideals of Camelot, justice, honor, and the protection of the weak became the blueprint for the code of chivalry that governed the European aristocracy. But the legend of Arthur was not just about an idealized past. It was also about a prophesied future. One of the most powerful elements of the myth was the ending, or lack thereof. After his final tragic battle at Camlan, the mortally wounded Arthur does not simply die. He is taken away on a barge by 3 mysterious queens to the mystical Isle of Avalon, to be healed of his wounds. The prophecy, the Rex Quondam Rex Qui Futurus, the once and future king, stated that one day, when his land is in its greatest peril, Arthur will return to lead his people again. This belief transformed Arthur from a historical figure into a messianic one. He became one of the sleeping kings, a hero who was not dead, but merely waiting.
This idea had immense political power. For the subjugated Welsh and Britons, it was a promise of liberation from their English and Norman conquerors. But the English kings, in a brilliant act of political appropriation, claimed Arthur as their own. Henry II, a Plantagenet with a tenuous claim to the throne, discovered the supposed graves of Arthur and Guinevere at Glastonbury Abbey in 1191. It was a masterful piece of propaganda. By finding Arthur's body, he could prove two things. First, that Arthur was real and that the English monarchy was his rightful successor, and second, that Arthur was well and truly dead, quashing any Welsh hopes of his return. The myth was so potent that it bled into the folklore of other regions. In Sicily, locals claimed that Arthur lived inside Mount Etna, his forge visible in the volcanic glow. The sword in the stone, the ultimate symbol of destined kingship, became a story told across the continent. In Italy, at the Montesiepi Chapel, there is a 12th century sword plunged into a rock said to have been placed there by a Tuscan knight named Galgano Guidotti, who renounced his worldly life to become a hermit. Whether this story inspired the Arthurian legend or was inspired by it, it shows how deeply the motif of the sacred sword resonated. The ghost of Arthur haunted the medieval imagination. He represented a lost golden age of peace and justice, a time when magic and faith coexisted, and when kings were truly noble. His story was a mirror in which the rulers of Europe saw their own aspirations and a tool they used to legitimize their power. The sword that sleeps in the stone or in the lake and the king that sleeps in the hollow hill were not just elements of a fairy tale. They were powerful symbols of hope, destiny, and the belief that even in the darkest of times, a legendary hero might one day return to make the world right again.
Charlemagne's talking horse and divine right. While Arthur represented the mystical king of a lost age, there was another monarch whose legend was just as grand but more firmly rooted in the Christian history of continental Europe. This was Charlemagne, king of the Franks and the first Holy Roman Emperor. In his lifetime, he was a brilliant military and political leader, but after his death, folklore went to work, transforming him from a man into a demigod, a saintly warrior king whose rule was ordained by heaven itself. The legends that grew up around Charlemagne, known as the Matter of France, served a clear purpose: to sanctify the Frankish monarchy, and by extension, all Christian kings. They were tales that reinforced the concept of the divine right of kings, the idea that a monarch is not accountable to his people, but only to God, because his authority comes directly from God. In these epic poems and songs, the historical Charlemagne is almost unrecognizable. He is depicted as a towering figure of immense strength and unwavering piety, his white beard a symbol of his wisdom and age, though historically he did not have one for most of his reign. He is surrounded by 12 legendary paladins or peers, the most famous of whom was Roland. These paladins were the continental equivalent of Arthur's knights, Christian champions who fought not just for their king, but for their faith. The stories are filled with supernatural wonders and divine interventions. Charlemagne does not simply win battles through clever strategy. God is actively on his side. In the Song of Roland, after his nephew Roland is tragically killed in an ambush by Saracens, Charlemagne prays to God, and God miraculously stops the sun in the sky, allowing the Franks extra daylight to pursue and avenge themselves on their enemies. This is a direct parallel to the biblical story of Joshua, explicitly linking Charlemagne to the heroes of the Old Testament. The folklore also endowed him with magical artifacts and companions. His sword, Joyous, was said to have been forged with a piece of the lance of Longinus, the spear that pierced Christ's side in its pommel, making it a holy relic.
His legendary horse, Bayard, was no ordinary steed. Bayard was intelligent, fiercely loyal, and so fast he could outrun any pursuer. In some tales, the horse could understand human speech and would weep at the death of his master. This talking, thinking horse elevates Charlemagne from a mere king to a master of a near mythical beast, a trope common to great heroes. The legends also had him battling not just human armies, but giants, demons, and sorcerers. He was said to have cleansed forests of pagan spirits and to have received guidance directly from angels who appeared to him in dreams and visions. Every story hammered home the same message. This was God's chosen king, and to fight against him was to fight against God himself. This sanctification was not limited to Charlemagne. The French monarchy, in particular, cultivated a powerful mystique around its kings. The kings of France were known as the most Christian kings, and their coronations were deeply symbolic religious rituals. They were anointed with a special holy oil, said to have been brought from heaven by a dove for the baptism of King Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks. This anointing was believed to grant the king semi-priestly status and even the ability to perform miracles. The most famous of these was the royal touch. It was believed that the king of France, and also of England, could cure scrofolia, a form of tuberculosis that caused nasty sores on the neck, simply by touching the afflicted person and saying a prayer. Thousands of sick people would flock to the court for a chance to be touched by the king. This practice, which continued for centuries, was a powerful piece of living folklore, a recurring public demonstration of the king's divinely granted power. Even a king renowned for his piety in his own lifetime, like Louis IX of France, later Saint Louis, became the subject of such legends. It was said that angels attended his private masses, that he could talk to saints, and that his mere presence could bring peace to a troubled soul. These myths were political tools of the highest order. They created an aura of invincibility and sacredness around the monarchy. They suggested that the king was not just another powerful nobleman, but a different kind of being, chosen by God to be the shepherd of his people. This made rebellion not just a political act, but an act of blasphemy. The stories of Charlemagne's holy sword, his talking horse, and his divinely stopped son were more than just adventure tales. They were the foundation stones of a political theology that dominated Europe for 1,000 years. They were the folklore that turned a crown into a halo.
Saintly bones and bleeding statues. In the medieval world, the line between the sacred and the magical was often blurred. While the church officially condemned folk magic, it presided over its own powerful system of supernatural objects, the holy relics. These were the physical remains of saints, a piece of bone, a lock of hair, a tooth, or objects they had touched, like a piece of their clothing or the wood of their cross. And these were not just objects of veneration, they were believed to be conduits of divine power, capable of performing miracles that touched every aspect of daily life. A relic was, in essence, a piece of heaven on earth. The body of a saint, or a corpus sanctum, was considered so infused with holiness that it did not fully belong to the dead world. It remained a bridge to the divine, a focal point where God's power could enter the physical realm. Every major church and monastery in Europe sought to possess an important relic, as it brought pilgrims, prestige, and immense spiritual authority. The trade in relics became a massive and often corrupt industry. The bones of the apostles and early martyrs were the most prized. An entire arm of St. George, a finger of John the Baptist, or a vial said to contain the milk of the Virgin Mary. These were treasures beyond price. A fierce competition for relics raged between cities and cathedrals. Sometimes they were purchased for vast sums, other times they were stolen in daring raids, a practice known as furta sacra, or sacred theft, which was often justified by claiming the saint wanted to be moved to a more devout location.
For the common person, a relic was the most tangible form of magic they could access. They would go on long, arduous pilgrimages, sometimes for hundreds of miles, just to be in the presence of a powerful relic. They believed these sacred objects could cure any illness. The blind could regain their sight, the lame could walk, and the lepers could be made clean. People would bring sick loved ones to be touched by the reliquary, the ornate container that housed the relic. They would leave offerings, pray for intercession, and hope for a miracle. The power of relics went far beyond healing. They were the ultimate protectors of a city. The relics of a patron saint housed in the main cathedral were considered the city's spiritual shield. In times of war, plague, or famine, the relics would be paraded through the streets in solemn procession, a desperate appeal to heaven for protection. It was believed that the presence of the saint's bones could ward off an attacking army, extinguish a fire, or end a drought. The folklore surrounding relics was filled with incredible stories of their power. Statues of the Virgin Mary were said to weep real tears in times of sorrow, or bleed when struck by a heretic. The bones of a saint might emit a sweet floral scent known as the odor of sanctity, or glow with a soft divine light. Sometimes relics were used as a form of trial by ordeal. An accused person might be forced to swear their innocence while touching a holy relic, with the belief that the saint would strike them dead if they were lying. This belief system created its own economy of secondary relics. Water that had been used to wash a saint's shrine, or dust collected from their tomb, was believed to retain a measure of the original's power and could be taken home by pilgrims as a protective amulet. Of course, the authenticity of many of these relics was highly questionable. The sheer number of artifacts was staggering. It was famously said that there were enough pieces of the true cross in circulation to build a whole ship. There were multiple heads of John the Baptist. This proliferation of fakes was an open secret, but for many believers, it didn't seem to matter. The power of the relic was activated by the faith of the pilgrim. If you believed the object was holy, then for you, it was. The cult of relics shows how Christianity absorbed and institutionalized the core principles of folk magic. The belief that a physical object can hold supernatural power, that it can be used to heal or protect, and that its power is tied to its history and origin. These are the same principles that govern the use of a magical amulet or a sacred herb. The church simply redirected this impulse towards its own saints and its own narrative. The saint's bone in its golden box was the Christian equivalent of a wizard's talisman. It was a piece of the other world brought into the mundane, a tangible promise that the chaos of life could be ordered and controlled by a power greater than oneself. It was a connection to the divine that you could see, touch, and pray to, a silent, powerful presence in the heart of the stone-cold cathedral.
The hanged man who came back to life.
Miracles were the currency of faith in the medieval world. They were not rare philosophical occurrences. They were vivid, dramatic events that were reported with startling frequency. They were proof that God was an active participant in the world, ready to intervene on behalf of the faithful. And among the most dramatic and popular of these miracle stories were the tales of resuscitation. The dead brought back to life. Every major shrine and every popular saint had a collection of such stories, carefully recorded by monks and eagerly consumed by the public. These were not just vague rumors. They were often presented as eyewitness accounts, complete with names, dates, and locations, giving them the weight of historical fact. They spoke of drowned children who coughed up water after a prayer was said over their bodies, of stillborn infants who gasped for breath at the moment of baptism, and of people on their deathbeds who suddenly sat up, healed and whole. But perhaps the most striking of these tales were those that involved the unjustly executed. The story of the hanged man who came back to life is a powerful and recurring motif, particularly associated with the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. The most famous version is the miracle of Santo Domingo de la Calzada. The story goes that a young German pilgrim traveling with his parents stopped in the town of Santo Domingo. A serving girl at the inn became infatuated with him, but he rejected her advances. Spurned and vengeful, she hid a silver cup in his bag and then accused him of theft. The boy was swiftly tried, found guilty, and hanged. His parents, heartbroken, continued their pilgrimage to Santiago. On their return journey, weeks later, they passed through Santo Domingo again and went to the gallows to mourn their son one last time. As they approached, they heard a voice. It was their son, still hanging from the rope, and he was alive. He told them that Saint Dominic had held him up, preserving his life. The parents rushed to the house of the magistrate who had condemned their son. They found him at his dinner table, about to eat a roasted chicken and a rooster. They told him the incredible news. The magistrate, annoyed and disbelieving, scoffed and said, "Your son is as alive as this chicken and rooster on my plate." At that very moment, the roasted birds on the plate suddenly regrew their feathers, stood up, and the rooster began to crow loudly. The magistrate, terrified and convinced, rushed to the gallows and had the boy cut down. The vengeful serving girl was, depending on the version of the tale, either hanged on the same gallows or stoned to death. To this day, the Cathedral of Santo Domingo de la Calzada keeps a live rooster and hen in an ornate cage high on a wall, a living commemoration of the miracle. The saying, Santo Domingo de la Calzada, where the rooster crowed after being roasted, is still known throughout Spain. This story, and others like it, served multiple purposes. First and foremost, it was an advertisement for the power of the saint and his shrine. It encouraged pilgrims to travel the dangerous road to Santiago, assuring them of divine protection. The more spectacular the miracle, the more famous the saint became. Second, it was a powerful story about justice. In a world where the legal system could be swift, brutal, and corrupt, the story offered a profound comfort. Even if mortal justice fails, divine justice will prevail. The innocent will be protected, and the guilty will be exposed, sometimes through an act that shatters the laws of nature. Third, it reinforced the social and religious order. The miracle happens because of the faith of the victim and his family. It is a reward for their piety. The skepticism of the authority figure, the magistrate, is rebuked by the divine intervention. It is a story that says faith is more powerful than secular authority. These tales of resurrection were not confined to the gallows. They occurred in churchyards, on battlefields, and in sickbeds. They were spread by traveling preachers, by pilgrims returning home, and by popular collections of miracle stories called vitae. Each city and region had its own local examples, its own resurrected child or revived elder, a story that became a point of civic pride and a cornerstone of local faith. For the medieval mind, death was not always the clear, irreversible biological event we see it as today. The line between a deep coma, a swoon, and actual death could be thin. This medical ambiguity left a space for the miraculous to enter. But more than that, these stories were a testament to a deep-seated desire for hope in the face of life's ultimate certainty. They were a defiant belief that even the finality of the grave was not absolute, and that with enough faith, a prayer to the right saint could call a loved one back from the silent land.
The Sleeping King in the Mountain. We have met King Arthur, the once and future king,
who sleeps in Avalon, awaiting his country's call. But Arthur is not alone. All across Europe, from the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked hills of Portugal, there is a powerful and persistent legend, the Sleeping King in the Mountain. This is the myth of the national hero who was not truly dead, but merely slumbering in a hidden chamber deep within the earth, waiting for the moment of greatest need to return and save his people. This is a folklore motif of incredible power and endurance, a collective dream of national salvation. The hero is often a historical king or warrior who is associated with a golden age of independence, strength, and justice. His death is often ambiguous or magical, allowing for the possibility of his survival. In Germany, the most famous of these sleeping kings is Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor of the 12th century. Historically, Barbarossa drowned in a river in Anatolia during the Third Crusade, but legend refused to accept such a mundane end for so great a leader. Instead, a story grew that he was not dead, but sat sleeping at a stone table inside the Kyffhauser mountain. His great red beard, the source of his name, has continued to grow over the centuries and is now said to be wrapped around the table several times. He is surrounded by his loyal knights, all in a magical slumber. Ravens, the birds of prophecy, are said to circle the mountaintop. The legend states that when the ravens no longer fly around the mountain, and when his beard has grown around the table 3 times, Barbarossa will awaken. He will emerge from the mountain, hang his shield on a withered tree, which will then burst into leaf, and he will fight one last great battle to restore the glory and unity of the German Empire. This myth became a powerful symbol of German nationalism in the 19th century, a promise of a unified nation yet to come. In Portugal, the sleeping hero is King Sebastian I. A young, chivalrous, and deeply religious king, Sebastian died in 1578 at the disastrous Battle of Alcácer Quibir in Morocco. His body was never definitively recovered, and this uncertainty gave rise to Sebastianism, a messianic belief that he would one day return on a foggy morning to reclaim his throne and usher in a new golden age for Portugal. For centuries, pretenders would emerge claiming to be the returned king, a testament to the power of this national hope. In Switzerland, the legend attaches to the heroes of the nation's founding. The 3 founders of the Swiss Confederacy are said to sleep in a cave near Lake Lucerne, awaiting the moment when Switzerland is in its greatest peril. In Ireland, the great hero Fionn Mac Cumhaill and his warrior band the Fianna are not dead, but sleep in a cave beneath the Irish soil, ready to rise and defend Ireland in its hour of need. These stories all share common elements. The hero is always in a hidden, inaccessible place, a cave, a hollow hill, the heart of a mountain. This makes the legend unfalsifiable. No one can go and check if it's true. Time inside the cave moves differently, or not at all, preserving the hero from the ravages of age. And there is always a trigger for his return, a specific prophecy, a sign in the heavens, or simply the moment of the nation's darkest hour. The myth of the sleeping king is a powerful form of collective wish fulfillment. It is a way for a nation, especially one that is occupied, divided, or in decline, to hold on to the memory of its past glory and project it as a future hope. It says, "We were once great, and we can be great again. It transforms a historical defeat or loss into a temporary setback. The hero's death is not an ending, but a long pause in the national story. The mountain itself is a potent symbol. It is a permanent ancient feature of the landscape, a silent witness to history. To place the hero inside the mountain is to merge him with the very soul of the land. He is not just a king of the people, he is a spirit of the place, a genius loci on a national scale. This belief is a profound comfort. It suggests that the nation has an eternal guardian, a secret protector held in reserve. It is the ultimate insurance policy against oblivion. No matter how bad things get, the story says there is a final, heroic solution waiting just beneath the surface of the earth. The sleeping king is the embodiment of national resilience, a dream of resurrection written into the geography of the homeland itself, a silent promise whispered on the wind that blows from the mountain's peak.
Goblins in the cellar and elves in the hayloft. We have met the household spirits, the brownies and domovoi, who act as guardians of the home, rewarding diligence and punishing sloth. But the unseen world of the house and farm was not always so benevolent. It was populated by a host of other beings, a menagerie of goblins, elves, and sprites who were far more mischievous and often far more malicious. These were not guardians, but pests, or worse. Let us return to the medieval farmstead. You have your helpful tomte, who, if treated well, keeps the barn in order. But what if things start to go wrong in ways that are more than just simple mischief? What if the milk doesn't just sour, but the cream is stolen night after night? What if tools don't just go missing, but are found broken and twisted? What if your best horse is found in the morning, not just with its tail tied in knots, but exhausted and covered in sweat, its mane tangled into intricate, impossible to undo elf locks? This was the work of a different class of being. In England, you might blame a goblin. Goblins were generally seen as grotesque, ill-natured, and greedy. They were the spirits of chaos and decay. A goblin in your cellar would not just cause mischief, it would actively spoil your stores, cause barrels of ale to leak, and create a palpable sense of dread in the dark corners of your home. They were the embodiment of all the little things that could go wrong, personified into a malevolent little creature. In Germany, you might fear a poltergeist, a noisy ghost that would throw objects, knock on walls, and create a terrifying racket in the middle of the night. Or you might be plagued by a cluricon in Ireland, a cousin of the leprechaun, who, if you failed to show him respect, would dedicate himself to raiding your wine cellar and tormenting you with drunken antics. The elves of folklore were also a far cry from the noble beings of later fantasy. While the high elves of myth were powerful and aloof, the common folklore elf was often a small, tricky, and dangerous creature. They were notorious for their love of tormenting livestock and humans. The elf shot was a common diagnosis for a sudden, mysterious pain or illness in a person or an animal. It was believed that elves would shoot tiny, invisible arrows at their victims, causing a sharp, stabbing pain with no visible wound. The only cure was a countercharm from a cunning woman. The tangled manes of horses were another sign of elfish meddling. These elf locks were said to be used as stirrups by the elves when they rode the horses for their own amusement all night long. A horse found in this state would be too tired to work the next day,
a serious problem for a farmer who relied on his animals. These creatures represented a different aspect of the relationship with the unseen. If the brownie was a spirit of order and cooperation, the goblin was a spirit of entropy and disorder. Belief in these beings was a way to explain and cope with the constant, frustrating struggle against decay and misfortune. When your hard work was undone by something you couldn't see or understand, a sudden illness, a spoiled batch of food, a lame animal, it was easier to blame a malicious goblin than to accept the random cruelty of fate. Dealing with these creatures required a different set of rituals. While you left offerings for a brownie to keep him happy, you used wards and charms to keep a goblin out. A piece of iron nailed over the door was a classic deterrent. A horseshoe, with its iron content and crescent shape, was particularly potent. The branches of the rowan tree or mountain ash were another powerful protector, often hung in the barn or the house. Certain actions were also thought to attract or repel these beings. Keeping a clean and orderly house was said to displease goblins, who thrived in filth and clutter. Spilling salt was not just bad luck, it was an invitation to evil spirits. But a line of salt across a threshold could prevent them from entering. These beliefs created a complex set of rules for daily life, a constant negotiation with a world teeming with invisible forces. You swept your floor and left a bowl of milk for the helpful spirits, but you also made sure the iron charm on your door was secure to keep out the harmful ones. It was a two-front war for the security of your home. The elves in the hayloft and the goblins in the cellar were the personification of life's daily anxieties. They were the strange noise in the night, the sudden chill in the air, the milk that curdled for no reason. They were the ever-present threat of chaos, a reminder that even within the walls of your own home, you were never truly, completely safe from the capricious and often hostile forces of the other world.
The Headless Horseman wasn't just a story.
There are certain fears that are so primal they seem to be etched into the collective human unconscious. The fear of the dark, the fear of the dead, and the fear of the headless pursuer. The Headless Horseman, made famous by Washington Irving's story of Sleepy Hollow, was not an American invention. He is a terrifying figure with deep roots in European folklore, a specter that has galloped through the dark lanes and lonely moors of the old world for centuries. This creature is known by many names. In Ireland, he is the Dullahan. In Scotland, he is a feared ghost of the glens. In Germany, he is the Wild Huntsman, who sometimes rides without a head. Whatever his name, his appearance is chillingly consistent. He is a rider on a powerful black horse, often with eyes of fire. But the rider himself has no head on his shoulders. Instead, he carries it with him, tucked under his arm or held aloft in his hand. The head is not dead. Its eyes are alive and dart about, scanning the darkness. The Dullahan of Irish folklore is perhaps the most fearsome of all. He is a harbinger of death, an unseelie fairy, meaning he is one of the malevolent dark spirits. When the Dullahan stops his ride, he calls out a name, and the person whose name is called will die. There is no escape. You cannot bar your door against him. All locks and gates fly open as he approaches. He is drawn to the dying, a psychopomp who has come to claim a soul. To even look upon him is to risk being blinded in one eye or having a basin of blood thrown in your face. His only weakness, his only fear, is gold. Even a single gold pin is enough to make him and his terrifying horse vanish. The origin of the headless specter is often tied to a violent death. He is the ghost of a man who was decapitated, either in battle, by an executioner's axe or through some act of treachery. His eternal restless ride is a desperate search for his lost head, or perhaps an act of vengeance against the world that took it from him. In Germanic folklore, the headless rider is often part of a larger ghostly procession known as the Wild Hunt. This is a spectral hunting party that tears across the winter sky, led by a figure who might be the god Odin, or a damned soul, or the devil himself. To witness the Wild Hunt is a terrible omen, predicting war, plague, or your own death. Among the ghostly riders and their phantom hounds, there is often a headless figure, his presence adding a particular note of horror to the cacophony. The Green Knight of Arthurian legend also contains a powerful element of this myth. He is a supernatural figure who arrives at Camelot and challenges any knight to strike him with an axe, on the condition that the blow will be returned in a year's time. Sir Gawain accepts and beheads the Green Knight, but the knight does not die. He calmly picks up his own severed head, which speaks and reminds Gawain of his promise, and then rides away. This story taps into the same deep, unsettling power of a body that can function without its head, a being that defies the most fundamental law of life and death. Why is this image so terrifying and so persistent? The head is the seat of identity, of reason, of the soul. A headless being is a creature that has been stripped of its humanity. It is pure, mindless, unstoppable force. It cannot be reasoned with. It cannot be pleaded with. Its lack of face makes it utterly alien. It is a body without a person, a vessel of pure, terrifying intent. The stories of the Headless Horseman also served as a very practical warning. They were told to frighten travelers away from being on the roads after dark. In a time before streetlights, a lonely road at night was a genuinely dangerous place, home to bandits and wolves. A terrifying ghost story was a far more effective curfew than any official decree. Certain roads, bridges, or battlefields became known as the haunt of a headless rider, places to be shunned by all sensible folk after sunset. The horseman is the personification of a sudden, violent end. He represents the fear of a meaningless death, of being cut down without warning. He is the ghost of the battlefield, the execution block, and the wayside murder. He is a fragment of a person, forever trapped between worlds, his rage and confusion given form in an endless frantic ride through the night. And if you are out alone on a dark road, and you hear the thunder of hooves approaching, the advice of the old stories is simple. Do not look. Cover your eyes. And pray he is not coming for you.
Long before the suave, aristocratic Dracula of Bram Stoker's novel, Europe was haunted by a different kind of vampire. This creature did not live in a remote castle. It was not charming or seductive. It was a product of the village, a monster that rose from the local churchyard. This was the Revenant, the one who returns. The belief in the Revenant was particularly strong in Slavic and Germanic regions, but tales can be found all across the continent. It was a fear born from the profound mystery of death and decomposition. Sometimes, when a grave was exhumed, perhaps to bury another family member, the corpse inside would be found in a shocking state. Instead of being skeletal and decayed, the body would be bloated and ruddy-faced, its hair and fingernails appearing to have grown, and its mouth stained with fresh blood. To the medieval mind, which had little understanding of the natural processes of decay, this was terrifying proof that the corpse was not truly dead. It was undead, and it was feeding. The Revenant was believed to be the corpse of a person who had been evil in life, a sorcerer, a murderer, an excommunicate,
or a suicide, or it could be the victim of a predator like a wolf, or the first person to die in a new plague outbreak. Their unquiet spirit was trapped in their body, driven by a malevolent hunger. At night, the revenant would claw its way out of its grave. It did not always transform into a bat. It often wandered in its own burial shroud, a terrifying, shambling figure. Its first victims were usually its own family. It would appear at their homes, call out their names, and by some supernatural means drain their life force. The family members would sicken and die one by one as if from a wasting illness. The revenant could also plague the village as a whole. It would torment the living with poltergeist-like activity, attack livestock, and spread disease. The creature was a focal point of contagion. Its presence was like a poison seeping into the community from the consecrated ground of the churchyard itself. One of the most common motifs in these stories is the role of the church bell. In many tales, the revenant would climb the church tower at night and ring the bell. Anyone who heard the ghostly tolling was marked for death. The sound of the bell, normally a symbol of divine order and community, was twisted into a funeral knell for the entire village. So how did a community deal with such a monster? They had a grim but well-established protocol. First, the suspected grave had to be identified. This was often done by observing which grave a black horse would refuse to walk over. Once the grave was found, it would be opened. If the corpse showed the telltale signs, the bloating, the ruddy complexion, the blood, the diagnosis was confirmed. The methods for dispatching the revenant were brutal and varied. The goal was to either immobilize the corpse or destroy it completely. The most common method was decapitation. The head would be severed with a grave digger's spade and often placed between the corpse's legs to prevent it from ever being reattached. Another common practice was to drive a stake through the corpse's heart. The stake was often made of a specific type of wood, like aspen, ash, or hawthorn, which were believed to have magical protective properties. The act of staking was not just about piercing the organ, it was about pinning the corpse to the earth, preventing it from rising again. Other methods included filling the mouth with garlic or a consecrated wafer, tying the limbs together, or turning the corpse face down in the coffin so that if it tried to claw its way out, it would only dig itself deeper into the earth. The most extreme measure was to burn the entire corpse to ash and scatter the ashes in a river. These were not just stories. They were actions taken by real people. Accounts from medieval chronicles and court records detail these gruesome exhumations and executions of the dead. For example, the 12th century English chronicler William of Newburgh recorded several detailed accounts of revenant problems in England and the methods used to stop them. The churchyard vampire, the revenant, is a monster born from the fear of contagion, both physical and spiritual. It represents the terror that the dead will not stay dead, and that the sins of a person's life can fester in the grave and return to poison the living. It is a much earthier, more visceral, and arguably more terrifying creature than its later, more romanticized descendants. It is the raw, primal fear of the animated corpse, the hungry dead among us.
Dream, our heart pounding, a feeling of dread clinging to us like a shroud. We call this a nightmare. But for the people of medieval Europe, the mare in that word was not just a metaphor. It was a literal creature, a malevolent spirit that was believed to cause these terrifying nocturnal experiences. The nightmare was not a dream you had. It was a dream that happened to you. It was an assault. The creature was known by many names across the continent. In English folklore, she was the mare. In German, the Mar or Alp. In Scandinavian languages, the mare.
in Slavic lore, the Mora. Despite the different names, the description of the attack was remarkably consistent. It begins in the dead of night, while you are deep in sleep. You become aware of a presence in the room. You are paralyzed, unable to move a muscle, unable to cry out. A heavy weight settles upon your chest, pressing down, making it impossible to breathe. You feel a suffocating pressure, a sense of pure terror and helplessness. You might see a shadowy figure, or feel the claws of a small goblin-like creature, or the body of a hag sitting directly on top of you. This spirit, the mare, was said to ride their victims through the night. It would sit on their chests, draining their breath and their life force. People who were mare-ridden would wake up exhausted, pale, and terrified, with no memory of a conventional dream, only the physical sensation of being suffocated and pinned down. The mare was often described as a female entity, sometimes a cursed woman or a witch whose spirit would leave her body while she slept to go and torment others. But it could also take the form of an animal, like a cat or a stoat, or even an object, like a wisp of straw or a knot of wood. This belief was a direct folkloric explanation for the phenomenon we now know as sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is a state in which a person is mentally awake, but their body is still in the state of atonic paralysis that prevents them from acting out their dreams. It is often accompanied by hypnagogic hallucinations, vivid, terrifying sensory experiences that occur on the border between wakefulness and sleep. The feeling of pressure on the chest, the sense of a malevolent presence, the inability to move. These are classic symptoms of a sleep paralysis episode. But without this scientific explanation, the experience could only be interpreted as a supernatural attack, and people developed a host of folk remedies and magical defenses to protect themselves from the mare. As with other malevolent spirits, iron was a primary defense. People would place a knife or a pair of scissors under their pillow, or sleep with a scythe by their bed. The mare was believed to be unable to cross iron. Another common defense was to create a trap for the spirit. A witch bottle filled with urine, bent nails, and hair might be hidden in the hearth. The belief was that the spirit would be drawn into the bottle and become trapped. Or one could try to confuse the mare. Placing your shoes by the bed with the toes pointing away from you was said to prevent the mare from figuring out how to climb onto the bed. A particularly interesting set of beliefs revolved around holes. The mare was thought to be obsessively compelled to count things. People would hang a hagstone, a stone with a natural hole through it, over their bed. The idea was that the mare would have to pass through the hole and would get stuck, or would be forced to count all the grains of sand on the beach before it could attack. Similarly, a sieve might be left by the bed, forcing the creature to count all the holes before it could do any harm, a task that would keep it busy until sunrise, when its power would fade. The word nightmare itself is a direct linguistic fossil of this belief. It is the nightmare, the spirit of the night. It is a powerful reminder of how a very real and terrifying human experience was once explained not by neuroscience, but by a story of a sinister creature that sits on your chest in the dark and steals your breath away. It is the folklore
of that terrifying liminal state between sleeping and waking, when the mind is awake but the body is still a prisoner of the night.
Or the shadowy otherworld that borders it. But there was one fear that transcended all others, a fear of the ultimate eternal destination for the sinner, hell. And in the medieval imagination, hell was not an abstract concept. It was a very real, very physical place, and it had a front door. This was the hell mouth. In medieval art, from the stone carvings on cathedral walls to the vibrant illuminations in manuscripts, hell is frequently depicted not as a gate or a pit, but as the gaping, monstrous mouth of a terrifying beast. This is the hell mouth. Its jaws are lined with sharp, vicious teeth. Flames and smoke belch from its throat, and into this horrifying maw, demons and devils are shown dragging the souls of the damned. This image was a powerful and brilliant piece of visual theology. It made the concept of hell instantly understandable and terrifying to a largely illiterate population. You didn't need to read Dante's Inferno to understand the horror. You just had to look up at the carvings above the church door as you entered. You saw kings and popes, knights and peasants, all being crammed into the same fiery mouth, their faces contorted in eternal agony. The hellmouth was a constant public reminder of the consequences of sin. It was the centerpiece of countless doom paintings, large murals painted on the wall above the main arch of a church depicting the Last Judgment. On one side, Christ would be shown welcoming the righteous into a serene, orderly heaven. On the other side, the hell mouth would be waiting, a chaotic, terrifying vortex of damnation. As you stood in the congregation, you were literally positioned between heaven and hell, forced to contemplate your own eternal fate. This imagery was also brought to life in medieval theater. In the popular mystery plays, which reenacted biblical stories for the public, the stage would often feature a physical hellmouth. It was a large, painted prop, often with a mechanical jaw that could open and close, and smoke effects created with gunpowder and incense. Actors dressed as demons would emerge from the mouth to tempt the heroes, and would drag the sinners, screaming, into its fiery depths at the end of the play. This was not subtle entertainment. It was a visceral, terrifying spectacle designed to frighten the audience into piety. Where did this powerful image come from? It likely has roots in older, pre-Christian mythologies. The biblical Leviathan, a great sea monster, was sometimes interpreted as a symbol of hell. Norse mythology has the Fenris wolf, whose open jaws stretch from the earth to the sky and who will swallow the god Odin at Ragnarok, the end of the world. The hellmouth is a Christianized version of these ancient, world-devouring monsters. It also reflects a deep-seated fear of being eaten, one of humanity's most primal terrors. To be damned was not just to be punished, it was to be consumed, to be annihilated in the belly of a cosmic beast. The fear of the hellmouth was part of a broader eschatological anxiety that gripped the medieval world, the fear of the end times. People believed that the Last Judgment could come at any moment. Every plague, every war, every famine was interpreted as a possible sign of the approaching apocalypse, as described in the book of Revelation. Preachers and prophets warned that the Antichrist was already walking the earth and that the final battle between good and evil was imminent. This belief could spark waves of religious fervor, millennial movements, and mass panics. People would give away their possessions, go on desperate pilgrimages, or join flagellant processions, whipping themselves through the streets to atone for their sins and the sins of the world before the final trumpet sounded. The hellmouth was the visual centerpiece of this apocalyptic worldview. It was the ultimate destination in a universe governed by a strict moral calculus. Your life was a series of choices, and each choice moved you either closer to the serene gates of heaven or closer to the fiery, waiting jaws of the beast. It was a fear that was meant to be productive. The terror of the hellmouth was a tool used by the church to enforce social and moral order. It was a warning, carved in stone and painted on walls, that your actions in this life had eternal and horrifying consequences. It was the ultimate monster at the end of the story, a creature whose gaping mouth threatened to swallow not just your body, but your very soul forever.
A final, soft exhalation. In the medieval world, to die well, ars moriendi, was as important as to live well. A good death was one that was peaceful, prepared for, and surrounded by family and faith. But beneath the official Christian rites of last rites and burial in consecrated ground, a whole other set of older, deeper beliefs persisted. These were the folk rituals of death, the magical precautions taken to ensure that the soul had a safe journey to the afterlife, and, just as importantly, to ensure that the body did not come back. The moment of death was a time of immense spiritual danger. The soul was leaving the body, and the body itself was becoming an empty vessel, a liminal object that was neither living nor fully part of the world of the dead. It was vulnerable, and so were the living who surrounded it. Many folk practices revolved around easing the soul's passage. As a person was taking their last breaths, it was common to open all the doors and windows in the house. This was to give the soul a clear, unobstructed path to leave. To hinder its departure was to risk it becoming a restless, trapped ghost. In some regions, a tile might be removed from the roof directly above the dying person for the same reason. After death, the body was washed and prepared for burial. This was a task for the women of the family, and it was steeped in ritual. During this process, all the mirrors in the house were covered or turned to face the wall. This was to prevent the soul of the deceased from being trapped in the reflection, or to prevent a living person from looking into the mirror and seeing their own death. And then there were the objects placed with the dead. This is a practice that stretches back into deep antiquity, a pagan echo that survived for centuries. While the church discouraged grave goods, the custom persisted. The most common of these was the practice of placing coins on the eyes or in the mouth of the deceased. This is a direct descendant of the Greco-Roman tradition of giving the dead a coin to pay Charon, the ferryman who carried souls across the river Styx into the underworld. Even in a thoroughly Christianized Europe, this ancient folk memory lingered. The coin was a toll, a fee for safe passage, an insurance policy for the soul's journey. Other objects were buried with the dead for protection or for use in the next life. A favorite tool, a piece of jewelry, or a personal item might be placed in the coffin. More unusual items, rooted in specific folk beliefs, have been found by archaeologists. Sometimes, the dead were buried with food and drink for their long journey. But many burial rites were not for the benefit of the dead, but for the protection of the living. These were the rituals of apotropic burial, magic designed to ward off evil, specifically the evil of the revenant or vampire we have already encountered. These practices reveal a deep-seated fear of the animated corpse. If a person was suspected of being likely to return from the grave, perhaps because they were a sorcerer, a suicide, or simply disliked in the community, extreme measures were taken. The corpse might be buried with a sickle or a scythe placed across its neck, the belief being that if it tried to rise, it would decapitate itself. The feet of the corpse might be tied together, or the tendons in the ankles cut to prevent it from walking. Sometimes the shoes of the deceased were nailed shut, or nailed to the bottom of the coffin. In some archaeological finds, bodies have been found buried face down, the logic being that if they awoke, they would only dig themselves deeper into the earth. Placing a heavy stone in the mouth or filling it with garlic or salt were other methods to prevent the spirit from re-entering or speaking curses.
The discovery of chicken feet or other animal parts in graves is more mysterious, but likely relates to specific local beliefs about deflecting evil or providing a substitute sacrifice. These practices were often carried out in secret, a folk undercurrent to the official Christian funeral. A family might have the priest perform the proper rites, but then, in the quiet of the night, they would take these extra precautions, just in case. It was a blending of two parallel systems for managing the terror and mystery of death. Even the location of the burial was significant. Most people were buried in the churchyard, in consecrated ground. But those on the fringes of society, unbaptized infants, the excommunicated, criminals, and suicides, were buried outside the church walls, often at a crossroads. A crossroads was a liminal place, neither one road nor the other. It was believed that the spirit of someone buried there would become confused and unable to find its way back to its former home to cause trouble. These forgotten rites show us that for the medieval person, death was not a single, clean event. It was a dangerous, messy transition, fraught with peril for both the living and the dead. And it required every tool at their disposal, from the prayers of the priest to the coins in the mouth and the sickle at the throat, to navigate it safely.
Only wind, the drip of water. Just as certain people were believed to carry a supernatural aura, so too were certain places in the landscape. These were not the grand, sacred groves of the old gods, but smaller, more intimate locations that had, through tragedy or rumor, become saturated with dread. They were cursed places, points on the map that people learned to avoid, where the air felt heavy and the veil between worlds was perpetually thin. Every region had them. A particular stretch of road where travelers always felt an inexplicable chill. A pond where someone had drowned, and whose waters were now said to whisper on moonless nights. A ruined cottage where a terrible crime had occurred, now shunned and overgrown, haunted by the echoes of that violence. One of the most common sites for such folklore was the watermill. The mill was a vital part of the medieval economy, the place where the village's grain was ground into flour. It was often located on the edge of the village, by a river, a place of constant noise and mechanical motion. But this isolation and the powerful, often dangerous machinery made it a natural setting for dark stories. The miller himself was often a figure of suspicion. He held a monopoly on a vital service and was frequently accused of cheating his customers by taking more than his fair share of the flour. This distrust could easily curdle into something more sinister in the popular imagination. The miller became a character in league with dark forces. The mill itself, with its roaring water, its groaning gears, and its dark, flour-dusted corners, was an inherently spooky place. It was easy to imagine other sounds mixed in with the mechanical din, a ghostly whisper, a sorrowful moan. Stories abounded of cursed mills where a previous miller had been murdered for his dishonesty, or had taken his own life, and his ghost now haunted the premises. These ghostly millers would cause all sorts of trouble. They might stop the wheel from turning, spoil the grain, or appear as terrifying apparitions to frighten away anyone who dared to work there. The river by the mill was also a place of danger, and tales were told of malevolent water spirits or nixies who would live in the mill pond and try to lure people, especially children, to a watery grave. The cursed mill became a place to be hurried past after dark, a symbol of industrial unease and social mistrust. Trees could also become focal points of local dread. While some trees were sacred,
Others were cursed. A tree could become cursed if a person had hanged themselves from its branches. From that day on, the tree was considered haunted, a vessel for the sorrow and despair of the suicide. It was believed that the tree itself was now in pain. People would report hearing it moan or cry on windy nights. Its leaves might wither even in summer, and its fruit, if it bore any, would be bitter and poisonous. To cut wood from such a crying tree or gallows tree was to bring the curse into your own home. Sometimes a tree was considered cursed simply because of its appearance. A tree struck by lightning, or one that grew in a strange, twisted shape, was seen as marked by some supernatural event. In some folk traditions, certain trees were believed to bleed real, red blood if they were cut. This was often a hawthorn tree or an elder tree, both of which have strong connections to the fairy world. To cut such a tree was a terrible offense to the spirits who lived within it, and would bring swift and certain retribution. And then there were the crossroads. We have already seen them as a burial place for the outcast dead, but they were also places of powerful magic and great danger. As a meeting point of four roads, a crossroads was a place of decision, a no-man's land that belonged to no single path. This made it a nexus for supernatural energy, a place where one could make contact with spirits, demons, or the devil himself. It was at the crossroads that a witch might perform her darkest rituals, or where a person might go to make a pact with Satan, trading their soul for worldly gain, a theme that would famously live on in the folklore of the blues musician Robert Johnson. But for the average person, the crossroads was simply a place to be avoided at night. It was where the ghosts of the unshriven dead would gather, where will-o'-wisps would try to lead you astray, and where you might hear a whisper on the wind, a voice from another world trying to tell you its name. These cursed places, the mill, the tree, the crossroads, served as a kind of mental map for the community. They were landmarks of fear, teaching people where it was safe to go and where it was not. They were the physical anchors for the community's collective anxieties, repositories for its memories of tragedy, crime, and social tension. They were a reminder that the world was not a neutral space, but a landscape alive with history and haunted by the stories of those who had come before. Gradual introduction of a ticking clock. The fires of the witch trials did not all go out at once. There was no single day when Europe woke up and decided that magic was no longer real. The fading of this belief system was a slow, gradual, and uneven process. It was a long twilight, a period of overlap where the old world of folklore and the new world of reason existed side by side, often in uncomfortable tension. This was the era that saw the last witch trials and the first stirrings of the Enlightenment. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the intellectual climate among the educated elite of Europe had begun to shift dramatically. The scientific revolution, spearheaded by figures like Isaac Newton, had introduced a new way of seeing the universe, as a great, intricate machine governed by predictable mathematical laws. This was a clockwork universe, set in motion by God, but running on its own, without the need for constant, capricious, supernatural intervention. In this New World view, there was little room for demons who caused hailstorms or witches who flew on broomsticks. Philosophers of the Enlightenment championed reason, skepticism, and empirical evidence. They argued that the belief in witchcraft was a relic of a superstitious, ignorant past. To them, the witch trials were not a noble fight against evil, but a shameful episode of mass hysteria and injustice. This new thinking began to filter down into the legal system. Judges and magistrates, increasingly educated in these modern ideas, grew more and more skeptical of the evidence presented in witch trials. They began to question confessions obtained through torture. They began to doubt the testimony of child accusers. They started to demand a higher standard of proof, one that could not be met by spectral evidence or the discovery of a witch's teat. As a result, the number of convictions and executions for witchcraft began to plummet. In many parts of Europe, trials still occurred, but they increasingly ended in acquittal. The great witch hunts, the terrifying panics that had swept through entire regions, were largely over by the year 1700. However, the belief in magic did not vanish from the general population. While the elites in the cities debated philosophy in their salons, the farmer in his village still worried about the evil eye. The old woman at the edge of town was still sought out for healing charms, and she was still the first to be blamed when the milk went sour. The old folklore was deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, and it would not be unraveled by a new book of philosophy. This created a strange divergence. The official, state-sponsored persecution of witches waned, but informal, local accusations and even violence could still occur. A person might be accused of witchcraft by their neighbors, and while they might no longer face a formal trial and execution, they could be ostracized, beaten, or driven from their village. The last official state-sanctioned executions for witchcraft in Europe are poignant and tragic landmarks in this transition. In England, the last hanging was in 1684. In France, 1745. The last in the Holy Roman Empire was in Germany in 1775. One of the very last in all of Europe was Anna Goldy, executed in Switzerland in 1782. She was accused by her employer, a prominent magistrate, of having magically placed pins in his child's bread. She confessed under torture and was beheaded. Her case caused an international outcry among Enlightenment thinkers who condemned it as an act of judicial murder, a barbaric throwback in an age of reason. These last trials are a window into a world in conflict with itself. They were moments when the old, deep-seated folk beliefs of the community clashed with the new, rational skepticism of the age. But even as the law changed, the stories remained. The fear of the dark forest, the belief in household spirits, the tales of ghosts and monsters, these did not require a court of law to survive. They simply retreated from the public square back to the fireside. They became superstition, old wives' tales, folklore. They lost their power to condemn a person to death, but they did not lose their power to enchant, to warn, and to explain the unexplainable in people's daily lives. The Enlightenment did not kill European folklore. It curated it. It put it in a different box, labeling it as a product of the past, something to be studied by antiquarians rather than prosecuted by judges. The fire of the witch pyre went out, but the embers of the old beliefs continued to glow in the dark, a testament to the enduring power of stories to shape the human world.
The forest still whispers. Our journey through the landscape of European folklore is coming to an end. We have walked through the whispering forests of the pagan gods, sat by the hearth with the household spirits, and watched as the shadow of the devil fell over the village. We have seen kings rise into myth, and common fears curdle into monstrous forms. We have traced the fading of this world as the light of reason and science pushed the old beliefs into the corners of the imagination. And yet, they have not vanished. The forest may now be mapped and measured, its trees cataloged and its paths marked. The house may be lit by electricity, its strange noises explained by plumbing and central heating. The world, we are told, has been disenchanted. But has it, really? The stories are still with us.
They are embedded in our language, in the holidays we celebrate, and in the fairy tales we tell our children. When you say, "knock on wood for good luck," you are echoing the ancient belief that a friendly spirit lives in the tree. When you throw spilled salt over your shoulder, you are performing a ritual to ward off the evil spirit that was believed to be attracted by the waste. When you feel a shiver and say that someone has walked over your grave, you are tapping into a deep, old folk connection between the body and the spirit. The creatures, too, are still here. They live on in our books, our films, and our games. The goblins, the elves, the werewolves, and the vampires have not died. They have simply moved from the village churchyard to the silver screen. They have been reimagined and reinterpreted, but their essential forms, their archetypal power, remain. And sometimes, in the quiet places of the world, something of the old feeling lingers. Go to an old village in the heart of a European black forest. Walk through a churchyard where the gravestones are leaning and covered in moss. Stand on a windswept moor under a gray sky. In these places, it is not so hard to imagine that the world is more than what we can see and measure. It is not so hard to feel the weight of the stories that have been told there for 1,000 years. The folklore we have explored tonight was more than just a collection of superstitions. It was a language for understanding the human condition. It gave a name to the fear of the dark, a reason for the cruelty of fate, and a shape to the hope for justice and salvation. It was a way for people to find their place in a world that was often mysterious, hostile, and overwhelming. These stories remind us that we have not changed so much. We still seek patterns in chaos. We still tell stories to make sense of our lives. We still have our own modern folklore, our own urban legends, our own fears that we whisper to each other in the dark. And so, perhaps the final lesson of this journey is that the old world is not as far away as we think. The forest still whispers, if you know how to listen. The old beliefs are not dead, but are sleeping, like the king in the mountain, waiting for a moment when we need them again. Waiting for a new believer to come along, to sit by the fire, and to hear their tale. Thank you for joining us on this long walk through the past. May your rest be deep and your dreams be peaceful.